Hi everyone, welcome to Learning Impact. In today's lecture, we will discuss difference between absolute poverty and relative poverty. So let's start. Okay, first is that we have to look into some differences of absolute and relative poverty from the perspective of its definition, geographical context, measurement, and main focus. So how can we define absolute and relative poverty? Absolute poverty refers to the condition that person is not able to achieve a minimum level of consumption. It means that it is a condition in which individual is not able to acquire their basic necessities of life. They are not able to meet their basic fundamental needs, which is the food, shelter, clean water, clothing. So these all are the basic needs which individual require to survive. So if individual is not able to meet these basic needs, it means he or she is suffering from the absolute poverty. So minimum level of consumption means the using of resources. So if he is not able to achieve a minimum level of consumption, he is not able to achieve a minimum level of resource utilization, which is required for his or her survival. It means this condition is called the absolute poverty. So it indicates the total number of persons who are considered to be below the poverty line. But in case of the relative poverty, it refers to a condition which focus on lower incomes or resources compared to others in society. In case of the relative poverty is a condition in which it is a possibility that individuals they are able to meet their basic needs, but it focuses that how well the distribution and incomes have been distributed among the individuals of the society and how the one society as compared to other in regarding the resource distributions at disadvantage. Or it might be that within a given society they discuss that how the different subpopulation of a given society is actually utilizing the resources and how much share they have get in their resources. So relative poverty focus on the living standards among the in comparison to others. It might be the comparison between the subpopulations of a given society, or it might be the comparison of one society with other. So we can say that relative poverty is the relative level of poverty among individuals, communities, or countries, but absolute poverty is the total number of persons who are considered to be below the poverty line, because it is not the focus. Absolute poverty focus on individual communities isolately. It does not focus on it in relative to other culture or communities or societies. Now, what is the geographical context? Absolute poverty mostly prevails in developing countries, while relative poverty is a widespread problem in developed countries. Now, when we say that absolute poverty mostly prevails in developing countries, it doesn't mean that there is no space for relative poverty in developing countries. Absolute and relative poverty both exist in developing and developed countries, but in case of developing countries, the most prominent poverty or the poverty from which the major section of population is suffering, it is the absolute poverty. In case of the relative one, it is more spread in developed countries. So in case of the developing countries, as we know, countries are poor, their economic structure hasn't been developed and their economy hasn't been progressed. So most of the population of the developing countries, they are actually they are focusing to meet their basic needs and which is required for their survival. So that's why the absolute poverty mostly prevails in developing countries. But in case of the developed countries, as you know that it actually focus on resources distribution and income level in comparison to others. So in case of the developed countries, individuals are able to meet their basic needs, means they are able to survive, but they actually focused at how much the income has been the income level or the resources has been distributed unevenly among the individuals of the society. Now, how can we measure the absolute and relative poverty? Absolute poverty can be measured through the poverty line. Poverty line is the estimated minimum level of income needed to secure the necessities of life. So according to World Bank, living on less than $1.9, per day, it would be considered poor. So for the absolute poverty, there has been a standard which has been set, which is called the income threshold, minimum income threshold, which has been set by the international community to understand that below this income threshold, if an individual or community is living, this condition would be called the absolute poverty. But in case of the relative poverty, it is measured through the Gini coefficient or Lorenzo curve. What does it mean by the Gini coefficient? It is actually the the coefficient which was derived to measure the income disparities and the resources uneven distributions among the individuals of the society. So this was named after the Italian statistician who formulated this coefficient in 1912, and this actually measured the income inequalities and inequalities in consumptions also. So Gini coefficient, this measure varies from 0, which means the perfect equality, to 1, which means the perfect inequality. So it is a scale which actually is set by the international community to measure the relative poverty. So it ranges from 0 to 1. 0 is is perfect equality and 1 is the perfect inequality. So how the nearer the coefficient is to 0, it means more equal the income distribution is. So countries with a Gini coefficient of between 0.5 and 0.7 could be described as having highly unequal income distribution, while those with the Gini coefficients of 0.2 and 0.3, which is more near to 0, they have relatively equitable distributions. So this is the method of measuring the relative poverty. These are all the standards which have been set by the international community. Now, what is the main focus of the absolute poverty? Its focus is the lack of basic necessities. It focuses that either individual or community is able to meet the basic necessities which require the food, clean water, shelter, or clothing. If individual is not able to meet these basic necessities, it making it difficult for them to survive. So countries in a developing countries where families they struggle to afford even one meal a day, or they lack access to clean water and proper shelter, it means this is the condition of the absolute poverty. But in case of the relative poverty, it focuses on the disparities. It is sometimes called the relative deprivation, because people living in this condition is not considered to be living in absolute poverty. It is said that one community or one subpopulation of a society is deprived of a basic resource, any resource or the income level which other subpopulation of the society have. That's why it is sometimes called the relative deprivation, which is the deprivation of the resources but in relative to the other subpopulation or any other standard. Okay, then the other difference is that what is the quality of life in case of the absolute poverty is very poor and miserable, because in case of the absolute poverty, as we discussed, that individual is not able to meet their basic needs, and it actually in case of the absolute poverty there is only one category, that is very poor. But in case of the relative poverty it is marginally better, because in case of the relative poverty there are two categories, that is very poor and other poor. Very poor are those who are at disadvantage as compared to other poor. So it facilitates the understanding of the relative population of different segments of society, and it displays the relative position of various segments of population in income hierarchy. So it focuses on disparities in income and living standards within a society, and it is, as compared to the absolute poverty, is marginally in better condition, because as those living the relative poverty have access to the healthcare and services, but it might not be better as compared to the other subpopulation who have the access to the best quality healthcare system in society. Then how can we eradicate the absolute and relative poverty? Absolute poverty, complete eradication is impossible, because mostly it is the extreme level of poverty. But in case of the relative one, there is a small margin of success where its eradication is concerned, because it's focused on the distribution of income evenly. If we start distributing the income evenly, the relative poverty become overcome. But in case of absolute poverty, we need a lot of struggle and effort and resources to to overcome the to make the people able to meet their basic needs. Now, what is the time frame? In case of the absolute poverty, there is a survival needs in present moment, because it typically addresses the immediate needs, the needs which is required for the survival. Otherwise, individual will not able to survive. So, the time frame is the survival needs in present moment, because it typically addresses the immediate needs and survival in the present moment. But in case of the relative poverty, it persists over longer period, as it relates to the ongoing disparities in income and living standards within a society. So it will take time to overcome these disparities, and it has a strong rooted structure which actually propagates the disparities. So it persists over a longer period of time. So what is the impact of absolute and relative poverty of individual? In case of the absolute poverty, it is an immediate threat to survival, because It is an immediate threat to survival, well-being, and health of an individual, as it is associated with the basic necessities. But relative poverty, it leads to the social exclusion. Social exclusion is social marginalization or social disadvantage or relegation to the fringe of the society, and less social mobility. And it might lead to the psychological stress, and maybe that one community or one subpopulation of a society, they have less chances of social mobility as compared to others because of the uneven distribution of resources. Okay, now what is the example of the absolute poverty? As we discussed, absolute poverty is more prominent in our developing countries. So we'll take the example of India, where there is a 22% absolute poverty according to our latest data. And relative poverty, if we discuss, as we discussed, it is more prominent in developed countries, as in case of Denmark. It has a relative poverty of 7% to 16%, according to our latest data. So this was all about the absolute and the relative poverty and the major differences that exist in them. This was the end of our lecture. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your questions in the comment section below. Like, share.